Welcome to the Focus on Why podcast. I'm Amy Rowlandson and I ask my guests one simple question. Why? Focusing on the importance of why, I share with you the relatable, uplifting and inspiring conversations I have with people from all walks of life. This podcast will encourage you to focus on your why to enable and empower you to achieve the success you desire. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why. Before we start, I would like to draw your attention to my weekly email newsletter, Friday Focus. Each Friday, I focus on one topic with one action arising. The link to sign up is in the show notes, or head over to amyrowlandson.com and sign up right now.
Today on Focus on Why, I am joined by the wonderful Scott McArthur. Hello, Scott. How are you doing?
Hello, Amy, and it's lovely to be here. I'm doing fine, actually. I'm doing very well.
Excellent. And where are you calling from today?
I live in a little town called Morton Marsh, which is in the Cotswolds.
Very nice too, and I know it well. I used to be from around that area, from nearby Stratford-on-Avon.
Lovely place. One of my favourite places in the world. I love it to bits.
Really?
Yeah.
Even with all the tourists?
Well, it's been great during lockdown because we didn't have as many tourists. But I don't think Stratford is as bad as Oxford, which is our other local town. It's infested with cars. Stratford's a bit better. But yeah, I know what you're saying.
All good. So what is it you're doing at the moment other than avoiding tourists in their cars?
Well, I spend most of my time at the moment broadcasting, to be honest. When lockdown came along, I was a professional speaker and I had 23 keynotes in my 3 months coming up, and they all just went like that. So it was very difficult. I had a couple of weeks where, if I'm absolutely honest, I went off the rails because it was difficult to deal with. But then I decided, well, can't do this. So I thought, well, what could I do? And I used to pay somebody to do all my filming and my editing, etc. And I thought, well, why don't I start to do it myself? So I started to do it. And then a friend of mine suggested that we do some broadcasting. I hadn't a clue what to broadcast about because normally I speak about the future of work, technology and science. But that was too big a topic. So I wondered what I could do. Then another friend said to me, look, you're quite a good storyteller, mate. Do a storytelling broadcast. So I started doing that. And I've now I've just done my 56th episode of that, which has been terrific. I've met, some incredible people, from Emmy-winning actresses to professors of psychology, biology, to zoo chief executives, to poets, to a forklift truck driver, so it's been amazing. And then I have another half to my life where something else I'm very passionate about is music. And for the last 20 years, I've ran a very successful website in Scotland. You can probably gather from my slight Scottish accent, I'm from north of the border. And that has taken off during lockdown because people have been stuck at home. We started a Facebook group that went from 0 to 11,000 members in 3 months, and we're still gaining 50 people every week. That's been amazing. Friday night broadcast, then after show party every Friday night. And we're having our first live get together in December. I put the tickets up on sale and they sold out in about 20 minutes. I mean, it's been unbelievable. So that's it really. I mean, I'm still doing a little bit of speaking, but the market's still, we're still waiting for that to recover. So I'm focused on the thinking and the broadcasting, basically.
Amazing. And your keynotes were centered on the future of work, technology and science. You did not foresee what was going to happen.
I certainly knew about the situation with viral threats. That's something that we've been looking at for decades. There's nothing new in viral threats. I think it's more the response to the viral threat that no one was predicting. None of the virologists were predicting that. So my main focus is on what we call disruptive technologies, which is nanotech, AI, and biotech. So the evidence that's quite interesting. I mean, the reason that we've dealt with coronavirus so well is because of the exponential growth of biotech. Because you would never have had a 3-month lead time from a pathogen to a virus to a range of vaccines without the exponential growth of biotech. So it's been amazing. It kind of proved one of the points, but no, I didn't predict it. Nobody did.
No, and you said that you sort of went off the rails for those 2 weeks, and you were not alone, although everybody did feel alone because they weren't able to really reach out and connect. It did feel a very isolated period.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the probably the music side has been more telling for me, because we came together. I mean, it's a friend and I who'd never done, neither of us had done any broadcasting before. We just literally pressed go on it, Amy. We just went go. We didn't have the right equipment. We didn't have the right microphones, nothing. And 10,000 people showed up, and we've now had all these people saying, if it hadn't been for you guys, I don't know what would have happened to me. And so it's actually been, this is not my area. I'd never thought I'd ever get into this, but it's been like a proper community we've created. And I'm actually really excited about meeting them all, because it's going to be weird, because they're all friends. I've got a large group of people I've never met who have become quite dear friends virtually. So it's quite weird, to be honest. And I'm not the most sociable person either, so that's even weird as well. So the whole thing's just weird. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
It has been weird, and yet as a speaker, your profession is built around engaging and building rapport with a community, with
absolutely.
your audience. So in some respects, you haven't really changed that much.
I think that's right. I mean, I call myself a professional storyteller rather than a professional speaker. And stories connect. I mean, one of the things I say at the end of my show is, I hope you have a story-filled week, because you never know, one of those stories could change the world. And that's true. The power of story has just proven itself to me in the last few months. And where governments and companies have failed to use story, well, we've seen the results. It's in plain sight that storytelling is powerful. Honestly, though, I never thought about it like that before. I'd thought about it for engagement, but I'd never really thought about the bigger picture, the much bigger picture. So it's been good for me in that respect, Amy.
So going from a position of it all being very difficult and losing that business from a financial perspective, and reinventing yourself and creating a new way of communicating with an audience, and then finding actually that one of your passions, being music, led you to that audience.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I knew when we wrote a book about it, 15 years ago, and it did really well, but I never thought, everyone's in their 50s, 60s and 70s now, and I never thought they were out there and interested in the tech. They are. And it's so niche that you wouldn't believe that it's so large. But yeah, so there's been a lot of lessons in it for me, and I have definitely changed my perspective on how I'm going to, when I get back into, when the market opens up again, I'll think differently, I suspect, Amy. I think I'll think differently. We'll see.
And you said you've met some incredible people along your journey, some of them being poets, doctors, actresses, psychologists, and of course your forklift driver. Don't leave them out.
He's amazing.
Tell me, will your keynotes include different stories?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't have an off-the-shelf keynote. I don't have a keynote. I tend to look at the challenge that the customer has set me, and then I will write a keynote in that context. But what I learned many years ago when I was working in the big consulting world, KPMG, I learned that it's good to have like a backpack full of stories. And that's where I spend my time. So it's almost like mix and match now for me. I've got about 300 different stories. It changes all the time. I'm developing it constantly. I call myself an archaeologist of my own life. And I basically pick and mix. It's like modules, Amy. I just pick and mix and then put them together to form another keynote. So that's how I do it. So no two are the same. Sometimes they're similar, but no two are the same. And I know this is a podcast, but behind me, I've got all sorts of objects. And each one of those objects is actually a story. And it means that I can mix and match those stories in the moment. So if a client asks me to talk about something, I can immediately, grab a skull or grab a clock or whatever, and I can show them it and I can talk about that artifact. Hence why my show is called Artifact Live. So, it's about trying to, I don't see enough storytelling in the corporate world. It's very rare to see storytelling in the corporate world. There's an awful lot of regurgitation. There's like people that I know they're very popular, but I'm not drawn into the guru world. I'm not impressed with Simon Sinek. I'm not impressed with it because a lot of the time these guys are telling other people's stories. I think you should start with your own stories. And for me, that's been a very rich experience, has led me in all directions. I had no idea. I'm not going to pretend this was something I aimed at and went for. I didn't. It was emergent, Amy. It was like an organic process where I realised, gosh, I remember that time. I did that, and it was that sort of moments of well, in the meditative practices, they call it kensho, and it's moments of sudden insight. And I think that is what I've been able to do for myself. It's almost like self-therapy, if you like, almost. But then the stories come out. No one can copy them because they're your stories. I don't need to remember them because they're my stories. So it becomes it feeds and feeds and feeds. So it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because you think as these things happen to you,
yeah,
you don't necessarily think in that moment, oh, this will be a fantastic story in the future.
That's right.
And you call yourself the archaeologist of your own life.
Yeah.
Or was it archaeologist or architect?
Archaeologist.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of people talk about being an architect of their life because they're creating what's forward.
Yeah.
But you're actually reflecting back.
I am. Yeah. And then that reflection backwards makes me go forward, because I can then, if I meet a client and they're looking at, they're wondering how to, I don't know, it could be anything, any corporate thing, like, how do we improve our sales pipeline? Well, I can help them with that because I know about that. I know how stories, it's that, facts tell, but stories sell. Facts tell, stories sell. And because of that, they're immediately grabbed by it. And then I can tell them stories and they go, oh, and then I encourage them to have their own stories. I make them think, because you can't predict the future. You can't, even though I talk about the future of work. Nobody's ever been good at predicting the future. Just doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's incredible. So a lot of my podcasts are stories. They're guests, just as yourself, coming on the show and sharing incredible stories of what they've achieved or what they've done or what they've experienced in some way. I then intersperse those episodes with my reflections, which then have consequences, have actions attached to those.
Yeah.
And essentially, that's what you're doing. You're reflecting on what's happened to you and seeing how you can apply that not only to your own life, but also reflect that into business, reflect that into relevance for others.
Yeah, and it's why people say ignore history at your own cost, because there are lessons there. I mean, we have had pandemics before. We have had artificial intelligence for over 100 years. We have, a lot of the things that people talk about like they're new, they're not new. They're just not new. They talk about things like, racism and diversity and all. None of that is new. None of it. And we forget at our own risk what we've done and failed with it, because we're human beings after all. We haven't changed. We're the same. Biologically, we're identical to the human beings that were around 150,000 years ago. So there's no, we need to pick that up. That's where there's new fields like, evolutionary psychology has come up in the last 10 years, because they're thinking exactly the same thing. What can we learn from, how we cope with different contexts, different environments? So there's nothing new in the world. And there's a Scottish saying, we're all Jock Tamson's bairns. And that basically means we're all the same. So a lot of it is very easy to pretend you understand the future, but you don't. You can see the trends, and that's as far as you can take it. And because I'm a former scientist, I worked mainly in biology. I'm a psychologist as well, did my master's in psychology. But I tried to bring all of those things together and use stories as the glue. So that's how I do it.
So this is really fascinating for me, because I feel like I've come to this whole epiphany late in life in terms of, oh my goodness, how could I not have known so many things that I know now?
Yeah.
And at what point would that have been really useful to have known sooner in life? And I don't do regret. Regret is futile. No. But the point of this epiphany is such that there have been, as you say, so much has come before us, and yet we seem to have this desire to sort of explore and experience it for the first time for ourselves.
Yeah.
And as you say, ignore history at our peril. And we do ignore history. We do, and it's there. It's like a map. It's a guide.
Yeah, and I mean the way you've picked up on one of the metaphors I use, the map, because my job is to take it beyond the map. There's all this undiscovered country, to misquote Shakespeare. And that I think my stories and then other people's stories can provide the compass, in the uncharted place, because we haven't been, although that much has happened before, we haven't been stuck in our houses like we have been in the modern context. We have historically, but not in the modern context. So I think the stories can help you through that. They can help you through it. And you become quite, one of my, and I developed this when I was an HR director, so back in my professional career, but one of the most worrying competencies I've ever met in anybody is certainty. And I am absolutely opposed to certainty. And if anyone appears certain to me about any subject, I know they don't know anything about that subject. They may well think they do, but they don't, because certitude is not a good sign. There's not a scientist on the planet is certain about what they're studying. And yet all these Facebook jockeys are all certain about how the science works. And it's hilarious. And the other thing, and it builds on what you said, the older I get and the more of my stories I'm becoming more familiar with, the less I know. And I'm a ferocious learner. I read 3 books a week. I'm constantly learning. And the more I learn, the less I know, if that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, it does. And you've just sort of quoted Shakespeare or misquoted Shakespeare, however you choose. And I will bring in the fool doth think he's wise, and the wise man knows himself a fool.
Absolutely.
So and that is so true. So it's learner and achiever are my 2 highest strengths.
Right. Okay.
And I recently did the Strengths Finder test with my son, and they were his bottom 2. Right. Okay. And it was like, that's interesting. That's probably why he's not enjoying academia right now, because empathy is his highest strength.
Oh, right. Okay.
As are restorative and winning others over, and it's just really interesting to see what were his priorities or his strengths in that space.
Yeah.
Now, I'm with you on the certainty, because everybody seeks certainty. Everybody wants that security, that safety.
Yeah.
And that's what threw us all into a state of the unknown last year when lockdown happened.
Yeah.
And everybody was clinging on for how do we get that certainty back? Well, if it wasn't actually there, but they thought they had this sort of reality of it was there for them. So tell me more about why you're so opposed to people such as Cynic.
Because one, he's never had a job, but 2, people like that. And I'm not going to pick on Simon Sinek. I'm sure I know a lot of people like him, but the guru movement is something that it's a bit like, it's quite funny, but also quite telling. You hear a lot of people saying around, for example, environmental science, how the older people caused the problem, and the older people are damaging the planet for the younger people, and the younger people all care about it. That's absolute nonsense, because the younger people are the ones that, I think Greta has got about 15 million followers on Instagram. Don't quote me, it might be 20 million. Yeah, the Kardashians have got 250 million followers. And that is the most unethical, unenvironmental, and it's young people. Most of Greta's followers are people over 30, So the whole thing is mixed up in a mess. It's not, but it's actually just human beings. That's all it is. All it is. And I think some of the likes of the gurus, they'll spout something. And they usually, the start with why thing that, that Cynic, the golden circle, he didn't invent that. He talks as if he did, but he didn't. That's been around that's from a Stoic principle, about 3,000 years old, So, and I think the sort of faddism, particularly in the workplace, is all led by a lot of that. It's led by, it's not fair. Daniel Pink's a brilliant author, a brilliant journalist, but he's also in the psychology, because he's not qualified to do it, and neither is Cynic. But the problem, I think, the main problem is that the scientists are not very good at communicating, and they will admit that. So you do, and I'm contradicting myself, but hey, I don't mind contradicting myself. Hence why you need a Cynic or a Pink to talk about these things, because the scientists aren't very good at it. And indeed, if a scientist is in the communication of science, they're often ridiculed by the scientific community. So it's very complex. And that's why I worry about the certainty. Simon Sinek will put a quote like, "Have a good day" on LinkedIn, and 10,000 people will comment how it's a brilliant comment. Really? So no, I'm not. I've read all the books. I wouldn't say anything without having read them. I have read them all. And they're okay. But that's why I would always look other places for that sort of, what's the word? I'm more interested in poets than I am in gurus. There's more in the poets than there is in all these gurus added together.
Tell me about the poets.
Oh, I became obsessed with poetry when I was at school, and it was mainly the First World War poets, the Sassoons and Owens of this world, Dilciet, Decorum Est, and all that sort of stuff that I'm sure most of your listeners have heard of. But in the last 20 years, I've become infatuated by poetry. The likes of John O'Donoghue and David Whyte come to mind, and they're the guys with the compasses. They're the guys beyond the maps. I mean, one of David Whyte's I had this amazing experience, Amy, where I was at an event with David Whyte, who, if you have never heard of David Whyte, he's an extraordinary poet. And I was at one of his events, and there was only 10 of us there. It was a little event in a Cotswold hotel. And I sat having a glass of red wine with him late into the night, talking nonsense, just talking about our upbringing, because we've got a very similar upbringing. And I asked him about his poetry, and I said, David, I've got to tell you this, I don't understand a lot of your poetry. And he turned to me and he said, neither do I. And a lot of what it's almost just like the Jack Kerouacs, the beat movement back in the 50s. A lot of it's stream of consciousness stuff, but every now and again, something hits. And there's one of his poems, it goes like this, and I won't do the whole thing. It goes, start close in with the step you don't want to take. Not the first, not the second, but the step you don't want to take. Now that is a beautiful and what I call a generative poem. It brings out, what are the steps I don't want to take? And then it starts you thinking. It's generative. And if there's one thing I'd like to achieve in my last quarter of my life and of my career, would be to support the whole idea of poetry being much higher on the curriculum and something that we could spend much more time thinking about, because I think it's the most noble of human arts. I absolutely adore it.
It's wonderful, and I love that poem. I'm going to check it out. Start Close In by David Whyte, and that's Whyte with a Y, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, so you just outlined your vision for the last quarter of your life.
Yeah.
Maybe there's more.
There's
who
lots.
Knows? But in terms of just touching back on what Daniel Pink was focused on, and that was autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Yeah. How do those elements fit in to your world?
I'm not sure about those sorts of things. I think a lot of that movement it's very easy to talk about, this is contentious, but people talk about diversity in the workplace. There is no evidence that a diverse workplace is a more successful workplace, but everyone says there is. There isn't. And it's a real challenge for the public, and I'm not blaming the public, and I'm not even blaming the diversity inclusion community for saying that. It's so difficult. It's so difficult to research these areas. I mean, there are many academics now say that evidence-based research in business is almost pointless because it's so complex. So to answer your question directly, those things, I'm not sure about them. I don't know enough about them. The original model was a guy called Kahn who came up with the SAM model. It's availability, meaning, and safety. And then they've all the contemporary guys have built on Kahn's model. So there is some academic credibility to it, but even there's not. Even Kahn himself says he's not sure about his model. So I think a lot of it, people just need to go behind the gurus and find out. Go to what in science we talk about. Go to first sources. Go to the source of the actual information. And the closer to the source you get in a lot of this stuff, the lesser the impact is. So that's why we get fads. That's why we get. I mean, you mentioned Strength Finders. Strength Finders is okay, but Strength Finders isn't always what they call repeatable. Your son's profile will change as it gets older. So all of these things there are layers and layers and layers of complexity. And if you ever talk to a professional academic psychologist, they will not even consider these things. They think, no. They are not repeatable. They are not academic. They're like astronomy. Astrology. They're no better. Like Myers-Briggs is no more accurate than looking at the stars. There's no. It helps people, which is great, but it's in terms of validity, it's no more accurate than Mystic Meg.
And this is the thing, isn't it? That people are reaching out to hold on to something because they want to. It goes back to Frankl, what's the meaning of life? And instead of that concept, it's a case of what is life asking of you? And so people want to have these boxes that they can put themselves in. They like to have that. It goes back to the certainty. They like to have that security of belonging, of like, I'm an ENFJ, perfect, I know where I fit now. And as you say, so what is it that focus on why means for you?
That's a really good question, actually. And the answer again is I don't know. Because if I look at my biography, my focus on why probably looks at fear of missing out. That's the honesty of it. It's not, I want to change the world. I mean, it's not. I mean, I grew up in a quite a difficult environment. Everybody around me had more than we had. I ended up, even when I was a research scientist, I was living in a squat. So I always feel, to this day, I always feel like I'm only 2 days away from going back to having nothing again, being back on the streets. So for me, that's probably the when I tell my stories, a lot of them are about the experiences I had trying to get out of that, and how, mentors helped me and encouraged me, and how it was almost like a fight to get out of to that poverty. And it's still the same. It hasn't got any better, not for me, but for other people, it's horrendous. And for me, that's a much more important issue than much of what you see on LinkedIn, etc. At the moment. It's still that poverty, the academic poverty, as well as financial poverty. So I think that's part of it. The other part of it is that I said earlier, Amy, and I meant it, I love learning. And I think that's because I wasn't good at it when I was a kid. I had learning difficulties and all the rest of it when I was a child. Because we moved around so much because of my dad's job, I was taught English in the Caribbean on a radio ham. And then I moved to Scotland and they taught a different language. They didn't teach English at the time. They taught a thing called ITA, which it's a phonetic form of English. Blew me out of the water. I had no idea. I was being told my spelling was wrong, but actually it was right. And so all this sort of stuff happened. And I think all of that had an impact on me as a person who becomes more and more curious about what the hell is going on here. So I think it's a long answer to your question, but probably fear of missing out is the reality of it. But if I'm trying to gloss it, I would say my passion for learning, my absolute ferocious curiosity.
Well, I mean, I'm with you. But that's something that is so important for me, and that's why I sort of find it difficult when others don't have that same thirst or hunger for increasing their knowledge base.
Yeah.
And yes, I also understand, going right back to, we're all different.
Oh,
we're all unique.
Yeah.
But in the same breath, there's that common community space that we are social animals. So we are animals that seek out others for lots of different reasons.
Absolutely. I mean,
so tell me.
Sorry.
Go on.
There was a book written called The Machine Stops. And in that book, written by E.M. Forster, who wrote Passage to India and all these pretty awful books. But Machine Stops, a very short book. He wrote it in 1909. That was the year that Tolstoy died, one of my heroes. Tolstoy died in 1909. And it's basically about a mother and a son. And everyone lives in a little pod under the ground because the earth has become polluted. And everybody spends nearly all their time studying secondhand knowledge and then sharing that knowledge with other people across the world using what is effectively the internet. That was in 1909, right? Now, I started by saying no one could predict the future, and they can't. E.M. Forster was lucky. That's one of the books that's turned out to be, right. You can cherry pick the things. But for me, you're absolutely right. And I think a lot of people have forgotten the point of the book is we need to be social, but they had destroyed the social element of it. So I do not want to be spending the rest of my life online. A lot of other people do, and that's they are absolutely nothing wrong with that for them. But I cannot wait. Tonight, I'm going to a concert tonight, and I cannot wait. I mean, I normally go to a concert 3 times a week, 4 times a week if I can. Yeah. But for a year and a half, I haven't been to a gig. So tonight, I'm so looking forward to get into a room with lots of smelly, horrible people drinking Guinness and having a blinking good time. I cannot wait. And I think we forget that at our peril, because a lot of companies that are now talking about, people working from home, if it's an option and it's good for that person, then that's fine. But generally, and you said earlier, we're all unique, we are, but we are herd animals. We like groups, and boy, do I miss being in groups. Gosh, I miss it. And I'm a wallflower. I mean, again, another contradiction. I'm a wallflower, so I don't get up and dance. But I just like to be with people, And so for me, let's get out of this technology and get onto real life again, please.
Yeah, you talk about the herd instinct that we have, and I guess that's why, as you mentioned earlier, the Kardashians have their 250 million followers, because they are just pulling the herd in one direction, and Greta has her herd.
Yeah.
So tell me, what I'm looking to understand more of is, you talked earlier about wanting to take it beyond the map, using your compass to go into an uncharted place. What does that look like for you?
That's another good question, Amy. Thank you for asking me that question. It probably means doing things that people wouldn't expect you. Let me tell you a story. The best way to do it is tell you a story. A few years ago, I was asked to do a keynote speech at IBM's annual conference, and it was in Vegas. And at the time, I was working for, the biggest IT company in Europe, a company called Atos, who do all the systems, all the healthcare systems, all the banking systems, the Olympics, all that. They used to be KPMG. Anyway, so I was over there to speak to IBM's 1,000. It was they call them the 1,000. These are all world-class technologists, mainly in the sort of what we call back office, so big computer stuff. And they asked me to speak about multimedia. And that was because at the time I was leading a team called the Impact Team, which were looking at how technology can be adapted to be used in different environments. So they asked me to come and speak about it. That was fine, right? So I turned up to do my keynote. There was these 1,000 people in this massive theatre. And I had in my hand a briefcase. And I walked onto the stage and I got a round of applause, walked onto the stage with my briefcase, and I opened my briefcase. In my briefcase was an overhead projector. I opened the overhead projector up and I started to do my speech using an overhead projector. And I'd got the old-fashioned, I don't know if you remember, you probably will remember the ones with the cardboard around them? So I got the slides made with cardboard around them, and I was showing them slides and writing on the slides, etc. And very gradually, there was this murmur of collective dissatisfaction developing in the room, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And I'd been deliberately bumbling a little bit. I'd been acting a bit of an Egypt, as they say in Ireland, and I sort of put my head down and I looked up and I went, "What's the matter?" And one guy, bit of a lag, you always get them, particularly in technology companies, "This is supposed to be about multimedia and you're here with flip charts." I said to him, "Is multimedia not, is a flip chart not multimedia?" And he looked at me and he went, "Well, yeah." I said, "And could you do this with technology, as you call it?" And I started to throw them into the audience. And I said, "Write your feedback on those slides and give me them back and I'll review them at the end," right? You can't do that with PowerPoint back then. It was 10 years ago. You can't do that with PowerPoint, guys. They started to laugh. Then the production team dropped the screen and I had a big full-on, proper presentation. And the point of that is that, and there's an adjunct to it. I'll tell you the adjunct in a minute, but we often, again, think that new is good, that, that's not the case. What's good is good. The other one that again, from a story of mine, when I was a scientist, we used to, I don't know when I can, do you remember the little slides we used to produce, the little, when you had an old camera? Well, in the scientific world, what happens is back then, we used to make them on glass. So they were very, very expensive. So if you were doing a talk, and my first talk ever that wasn't in an academic environment was to talk about the Lockerbie disaster in front of 100 academic pathologists and anatomists, because I was involved in that project. And we would be making these slides, and each slide, and I've tried to work it out and I can't quite work it. I don't know if this is right, but I reckon each slide at the time was costing about £50 to make. So you had to get them right. You couldn't afford just to bash some stuff down and then get it into a slide. And that slow thinking is something, again, I think we've often forgotten, because I haven't used PowerPoint for 10 years, but PowerPoint almost forces you into that, bullet points and all that sort of stuff. But the glass slides slowed you down. And that meant the slideware, as they called it, was better quality. That meant the slideware had more thinking behind it, because there wasn't this convenient shortcut. So I often say to people, is that a convenient shortcut? Because if they could slow down often, and I'm also a lifelong 30-year meditator, and I've learned a lot from that practice, but if you could slow down and the system can slow you down, I think you think clearer. So I think that's a long answer to your question, but for me, these are two stories that I think can point someone, can give them a compass to say, wait a minute, not everything's disposable and easy, like Kim Kardashian, not the human being, the product of Kim Kardashian. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And you referenced Ken's show earlier, and how that's really helped you. Thinking fast and slow, the Daniel Kahneman work, you mentioned earlier about how the cynics and the pinks have translated what can be complex into the more simple, digestible language. And reading Kahneman is more, it's more difficult. It's not an easy read. Yeah. So it is that translation of messaging, and that's where you come in as sort of blurring or sort of molding the two words of science and art together.
Well, you see behind me, I've got the Rosetta Stone behind me. It's about translating. Danny Kahneman doesn't. Most of that book now is out of date. And Danny and his laboratory and the other laboratories round about him, because there's a gaggle of them all close to each other. I really admire him. I think he's he's a genius. He deserves, the accolades. But he knows that in that book, that's not an easy to read book for the public, certainly. And a lot of it, the big challenge these guys have got, particularly somebody like Danny, who works in a very difficult area. We still have the public thinking that Freud and Jung are relevant, whereas in the scientific world, they've not been relevant for 30 years. So he's trying to introduce a new way of thinking about the brain, and it's very difficult because it gets a lot of resistance. But there is now what I would call a coterie of very good academics in that space. But I have to say, even Danny gets criticised from the harder scientists, because the methodologies are very, very difficult. One of my heroes in that space is Oliver Sacks, and Oliver Sacks was ridiculed all through his life because he was a storyteller. The scientists didn't like him because he did everything through story and did everything through individual one-off case studies. Now, that isn't scientific, but I would argue it was beautiful and very worthwhile. But, so mentioning that reminds me that it's complex again. Back to complexity, Amy.
And knowing that the future doesn't exist, let's just imagine for a second that we've gone forward 3,000 years. Yeah. And there are a group of people who are following the work of Scott McArthur in the same way that you follow the Stoics and the poetry of all yesteryear. What message would they be saying?
Don't believe a word he says. Simple. It's that simple, and I mean it, because there are very few intellectual groups in history like the Stoics. And the Stoics only really exist because they had the time, they were rich, most of them were rich, and well, there's one or two were ex-slaves, but most of them were rich people, rich men who came through, and they live today, they exist today. But all the other movements have all gone, and I include, the movements from the 50s, the 60s and the 70s, and indeed the 80s, they've all gone. So if you look in the scientific community, everybody talks about standing on the shoulders of giants. That's right, because if all I could ever do is give somebody that moment where they go, I'm going to challenge that. I'm going to try and do that differently. I'm not going to do it like everybody else does. I'll do it differently. That would be enough for me. That would be a legacy enough. But no, they will, like everybody else. I hope my legacy is for my children. Academically and speaking wise and professionally, it's highly unlikely I'm Albert Einstein. I'm in my 50s now. It's a bit late.
Oh, I think I could challenge that and don't believe a word you say. I don't think that age has got anything to do with it. And I think a lot of of very intelligent people have come to fantastic conclusions or insights at late ages.
They have, but it is an absolute fact that your IQ deteriorates after the age of 25. So there are issues like wisdom, which is what I would frame what you've just said is about. And indeed, yeah, absolutely, wisdom. But to create something like an Einstein did, it is usually something that happens in the 20s and early 30s, and then it's gone.
And what about EQ?
Well, EQ again is challengeable. There's not. There is some good research in that space. That's to do with the emotional side of humanity. I think that can help, and it can develop, but it's a complex area. There's not. I mean, the only thing I would ever put my mortgage on and your mortgage on would be IQ, which is obviously very different to EQ.
So are we in an information age? Are we in a purpose age? Are we in a future state of bio or AI stage? Where are we? Where do we sit right now?
Gosh, that's a cracking question. I mean, I don't think, I mean, like information's everywhere. That's true. I think we're in a paranoid stage. And I think that's because we can see ourselves in the mirror. It's not because we've changed, because we haven't. It's because, I mean, social media, for all its faults, the bottom line with social media is it's a mirror, and it's just showing us what we're really like. Whereas before, it's a bit like when you grow up in a little village, you think the corner shop has the best bread in the world, and you think the butcher's got the best meat, and you think the beer's the best. Then you move out of town and you think back to it as if it was special. And it was in your life, it was special, of course it was. But the bigger it comes, the smaller it gets. And I often talk about science fiction in this respect, because if you look at, like, there's the Star Trek model and the Babylon 5 model. So you've got the Babylon 5, I don't know if you know Babylon 5, but it's where all the different parts and cultures of the world are maintained under a common purpose. Star Trek is they all are the same, and it's the aliens that are the difference. And I like the Babylon 5 model. I think coming together, but experiencing and understanding our cultures is something that we're actually getting closer to in the information age or the technology age. It's maybe even the post-technology age, because, I mean, iPhones have only got another 5-6 years, then they're gone. So that's going to be a big step again, but it's so exciting. I mean, it's the safest the world's ever been. There's less poverty than there's ever been. There's fewer wars than there's ever been. There's fewer terrorism than there's ever been. But you wouldn't know it, would you? Everybody's panicking. So I think information is shown us in the mirror, and I don't think a lot of us like what we see.
Yeah, it's a really powerful metaphor there. And in terms of you referencing that the Stoics are very rich.
Yeah.
In sort of a financial perspective, but also from an academic perspective. You mentioned earlier about academic and financial poverty.
Yeah.
Where do we sit on this? Is there a spectrum? Is there a scale on that right now?
In terms of what, against what, other countries, or what?
In terms of history.
Well, we've got more. Well, even in my lifetime, I mean, when I went to university, so that would be in the 80s, only about 3 to 5% of kids went to university. Now it's significantly over 70%. Is that a good thing? On the face of it, you would probably say yes. However, the quality of the education has changed. Many of my friends are teachers and they're doing very good work, but there is some capability gaps here. It's why, one of the things that sometimes people get wound up when I say, I think it's an imperative that we go to Mars. Absolutely global imperative. It will save our lives. And that's not because I ever think we'll live on Mars. It's because it will encourage young women and young men to study science. That's what happened when we went to the moon. And China's looking at sending a woman to the moon. Wow. That will change the world like nothing else can. I don't like the fumes and all the problems that these rich guys are causing with their spaceships, but we need to go to Mars. It will save the world. So a lot of that stuff, again, it's rooted in history. It's what happened when Apollo happened. It's what happened when it's all happened before. So I think the education system, we need more people studying the STEM subjects. That's really important. There's not enough.
Yeah, and I remember that dream of getting the man on the moon, and it being so important as a bigger picture vision because of what it represented. It wasn't just a case of getting someone physically on the moon with the power of essentially the calculator that we use today.
That's right.
It was way more than that. And again, it's having that aspiration for something else. Scott, I feel we could talk for hours, and it's been a fabulous conversation. It really has. How could people get in touch with you and find out more about the work you're doing?
The best way is use the hashtags all over social media. So hashtag Artifact Live, that's Artifact Live, all one word, or go on to YouTube and put my name in, Scott McArthur. There's a couple of drummers of me called Scott McArthur, but the name's fairly unusual, so you can find me there on YouTube. And I'm on all the other, I'm on, it's usually at Scott_McArthur on Twitter, on Twitch, on TikTok. It's all the same label.
Amazing. Well, they'll all go in the show notes so people can grab them there. Thank you so much. Absolute pleasure. How would you like to conclude today's episode for me?
Okay. One of the things that I think, and I'll go right back to the point of your show, the why. There's a number that means a lot to me, and if anyone ever sees the video, they can maybe try and find it behind me. But the number is 28,000. It's the most important number in your life, Amy, and it's the most important number in anyone's life, because it's the average number of days that someone lives for. And I believe we talked about it earlier. We've gone beyond a lot of technology. We've gone beyond a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, but we're very busy and we're very distracted by the social media mirror. So I think, we need to stop being so claustrophobic about data. We need to drop a lot of the measurement in society. But I would give one measure that I think everyone should think about, and that measure is this. Take away all the toxins of the KPIs, key performance indicators, take them away, they're toxic. But here's one for you to finish on. It's called time well spent. Anything you do should be time well spent. And that includes listening to me on this podcast. If it's not time well spent, it's not worth doing.
Thank you for listening to Focus on Why with me, Amy Rowlandson. To show your appreciation and to help other listeners understand what value you have received from tuning in today, please leave me an Apple Podcast 5-star review. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. To keep it going, connect with me on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook or Twitter, or join the inspiring, uplifting and positive Focus on Why Facebook group. All the links are in the show notes. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why.